In our next session here, I'm very pleased to introduce Steve Yap, who is the Managing Director of Media Technology Platforms at Google, and Michael Loban, who is the Chief Growth Officer at InfoTrust, to talk to us a little bit more about some of the ways that technology is evolving and some of the ways that those strategies are evolving to meet the needs of our consumers. So, Steve and Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone.
It's like revered silence, like when people come up on stage.
Fascinating presentation, and Steve and I were just chatting about the importance of visualization and context, and I suspect we're going to revisit this in the next half an hour or so. But before we dive in, maybe we can talk a little bit where we've been. Steve, I think you and I met the first time about 10 years ago, way before GA4, way before Universal Analytics, when Google Analytics Premium was announced. And over the past 10 years, what are some of the trends, changes have you noticed in the industry?
Yeah, well, so first, thank you for having me here today. So yeah, 10 years, wow, like that's, I met you when we first launched the premium program. So it's been interesting, right? And even to go back just a little bit further, I've been at Google for about 15 years now, the result of the DoubleClick acquisition back in 2008. And one of the fascinating things I actually have seen is that seems like we're coming full circle again. Right, like when you look at it, when you look at the industry in terms of its evolution, it's oftentimes you come back to an interesting parallel of a time before. So if you would all remember, right, like back in the early analytics days, you had things like web trends, which would be installed on the software side. You had server-side based infrastructure. We're pretty close to that, right? We're running in an interesting parallel now as everything moved all of a sudden into the webosphere, if you will. Installed software began to kind of take a back seat to kind of the digital solutions that were out there. And now coming full circle, now you've got, instead of server-side based applications, you've got cloud-based infrastructure. Instead of software, you've got applications. Right, and so everything's starting to come back to those entities and those businesses that own it. And so, as kind of when you look back at the evolution, so much has changed, even if it is kind of stayed the same, if you will. But I do think that the technology as it evolves has become much more powerful. I think the question just remains: are we able to kind of get the most out of it? As it evolves.
What do you wish you knew when you were getting started in this space?
I wish I knew the housing market would have blown up to my benefit. I mean, look, like I honestly, when we started GA Premium all the way back in like 2009, with Amy Chang, it actually started on a simple premise, right? Which is like data is going to be the foundation of all advertising, and then it will become then the lifeblood of every single company out there, and more specifically, it would be consumer data, right? Behavioral data. I honestly, looking back over these last 15 years, 10 probably with analytics, I really think that we should have doubled down on kind of that first party data story. Even though, obviously analytics is considered first-party data, I'm talking really just kind of consumer-based, loyalty-based information that companies have and kind of develop relationships off of. I don't think enough companies have done that, and I think currently we're finding a lot of them out there that are struggling, quite frankly, because they are in fact data poor. And now with the educated consumer, consumers a little bit more discerning in terms of who they're going to share what with. So it's asking for that information has gotten tougher and tougher.
And how do you view the role of Google Analytics changing in a privacy-centric environment when consumers are concerned about who they share their data with?
Yeah, that's often a good one, especially I'd broaden it to the role of technology in kind of a privacy-centric world. I mean, and Google Analytics is a great example of that. So look, there needs to be a greater level of responsibility, right, from all of us, whether it be the vendors, whether it be the vendors and technology providers to the companies that have the relationships with the consumers. I think analytics, when you look at it as a first-party data construct, it will continue to evolve and get much tighter, right? But in that actually is where the value ends up being, because it's forcing a lot of these companies to really evaluate their first-party data, their first-party relationships, their strategies, and really kind of get to understand their consumers and be very not only knowledgeable about what they care about and why they care about it, but how they actually leverage that data and how they use it. The technology itself will continue to evolve, like I would imagine all of the industry technologies out there, which will be compliant and privacy safe. No one, despite what they say or do, no one really goes into this business and goes, hey, like, I can't wait to violate a privacy policy and be on the cover of the Wall Street Journal and just, get stared at in my neighborhood. Like, no one wants to do that. So I do still believe in the integrity of our industry and those who operate within it. And I think analytics is going to play a really important part of that.
I think over the past few years, this idea of mindfulness, being intentional, started to really become important. And I think we see the same thing in business analytics, right? How do we become intentional about what data we collect? Not just let's aggregate and down the road we'll figure out what to make of it, which I think is a good sign for everyone.
Yeah, it's definitely a good sign, right? Like, gone are the days of like, oh, let's slap a tag on it and just collect, at will, and then kind of sort through it later. Those very kind of philosophies where, quite frankly, like that used to be kind of one of the standards in the industry. Those things are gone. I remember when we first launched Premium, part of the program was to do audits, because one of the theses I had was, look, like I seriously doubt, if you've installed Google Analytics for free, and that was obviously one of our intentions was, if you install Google Analytics for free and you're interested in kind of getting in the enterprise upgrade, I have questions as to whether have you done that correctly. And oftentimes people weren't measuring what they thought they were. And in some of those audits, actually, I remember being in a meeting where we were coming through the audit, and one of my implementation heads was coming through, and he's got this look on his face, and I'm like, what's going on? He's like, we found 38 different tags on their homepage. And I was like, do they know about them? And he was like, they thought they had 5. So it's one of those things of being very intentional, right? Being very, having all of those systems and processes heavily scrutinized, which they are already from a compliance standpoint, but not only knowing what's on there, but most importantly from a business context, why they are on there, which I think is, that's basically where the industry has evolved the most, I think.
And I think the other portion of that, if I may add, is also who actually owns it and who is the benefactor within the organization of the data that this tag is collecting or supposed to collect, which is not always easy to find that person.
Yeah, it's never easy, right? Nor is it kind of. Well, let's put it this way. Internally at a company, it'd be tough. Like, where's Frank, who installed all these damn tags, and why did he do this? Right? Like, you don't want to be the one to call poor Frank out. Like, the guy's off just doing his job, so he thinks. But you bring up a great point, right? Which is for when people go into the analytics framework, and let's pause for a minute, right, and kind of really just level set here. Like, it's called analytics, right? All of these solutions are called analytics, but very seldom do they actually do analysis, right? The reporting engines, the reporting tools, they're getting better, right? And I think with the advent of that magic word that you keep on hearing, at least the initials of them, AI, the hope is, and the promise is that they will become analytic engines. But inside kind of something like an analytics tool or any measurement tool for that matter, what often determines the success of any company who's implementing it is actually their culture, it's actually quite fascinating, right? Like you know, there are several different solutions out there, but often the success is determined by the culture. And do you have a culture of you know, democratizing data inside your organization, getting the data to the people who need it in the times that they actually need it? See a couple of people smiling there. Perhaps, you know, you need to talk to your CIO, but. You know, and then you know, there's no right or wrong way, right? Because I do know of other companies who, you know, basically the office of the CIO is the gatekeeper of the data, especially all data, and rightfully so, but they create gateways in terms of how you interact with it, right? But there are companies that absolutely, you know, they implement technologies like these, and culturally, they're not set up for them, right? They're often siloed. They're often not communicating with one another. Marketing doesn't know what merchandising is doing. Merchandising doesn't know what marketing is doing. The website's oblivious to both. And so it becomes really difficult to operate within those standards. And then oftentimes, regardless of who's operating the technology, it fails, right? So that would be probably the biggest thing in terms of, like, when I think of intentionality, like when you go into these things, like not only what is your intention and objective of doing it, but do you have buy-in from the rest of the organization to actually make it successful?
It seems like culture still eats strategy for breakfast.
I would say so. I would say so in many of those instances.
So you recently took a new role. In this changing environment, what are you excited about in your new role, and what do you wish to accomplish?
So I am the head of the GMP for the Americas now, and I mean, interestingly enough, just from a history standpoint in my career, like I've been a part of DoubleClick in some way, shape, or form since '99. Which I probably shouldn't say on stage live in terms of dating myself. And I left for like a brief summer break to start Omniture's channel program before they got bought, and then came back to DoubleClick, and then we got bought by Google. So it's been a very long road, right? And seeing the evolution of technology, one thing has been consistent throughout, right? Which is, and this is just as an industry as a whole, is the promise of digital. And wherever you are in your career, whenever you started in digital, I'm sure you all remember that there is a technology, or has been a technology, or if you started as early as I did, the promise of digital marketing was that we were more measurable, more actionable, right? More intentional. I don't think we've made good on that promise, right? We've had some flashes of brilliance here and there. We come up with, you know, the great thing about our industry is that we're so innovative that anytime you've got a problem, there's a technology that gets created for it, right? And so really what I'm most excited about as we enter into this now next evolution of digital, right, where cookies are going to be redacted. I'm sure you all heard that long time story. But like, as we start to come into here, right, the entire industry was predicated on that technology. So it's wild. Right? Like, you're a part of an industry that is going to be forced to reinvent itself. Like, you're going to become the creators. You're going to become the innovators. And you've never been able to do that before, right? The people who came through digital marketing, like the first ad server that DoubleClick ever spread out, that's what they established. But now it's our time to actually establish what this will look like going forward. And I'm excited that we can make it more intentional. We can make it more relevant. We can make it, you know, more safe for everyone involved. And I do, again, believe in our industry, and just really excited for the future, and especially be leading this group.
So you mentioned innovation, right? If I understand correctly, every time we obviously run into a certain challenge or there's a change, we are very competent and coming up with new technology and solve for it. So let's talk about the new technology, AI, right? I suspect many people get goosebumps when we talk about AI, especially if you're an analyst, and now you can see tools that create, whether it's dashboard without you actually participating with the creation of it, whether it's some kind of creative, and now you can have multiple versions of different creative that is being done through AI. What do you see as a role of an analyst in the AI-powered environment?
Yeah, so first off, like, I guess people get goosebumps or they yawn because, I mean, raise your hand if you've heard AI in the last 24 hours, like more than 20 times. But no, all jokes aside, it's exciting, right? It's again, in this new era of technology, it's pretty cool. But I have heard this story before. I've heard this story before when DoubleClick came out with its first ad server, right? And we unified measurement, and the media assistants and media analysts were like, oh, we're all going to be out of a job. Well, then they became traffickers. Okay, then programmatic hit. Like, well, what's going to happen to the traffickers? Because programmatic's going to be automated. No, it wasn't automated. It needed human intervention, right? The algorithms work, but they need to be educated. And the people who are educating them are, yes, it's data, but it's the people who are feeding those algorithms. So when I look at like a business analyst, right, in terms of the AI and how AI can actually help, do a lot of these things that are very labor intensive, right, like in terms of building reports, in terms of taking multiple data sets and just finding the commonalities or the corollaries within those data sets. When I think about that, I actually think that the business analysts become even more critical for those roles, specifically because you need the relevance as to what you're looking at. So Mona was dead on. It was sometimes the data is shit. And that's because, like, if you do not have the relevancy, the relevant cases as to the framework as to why this is telling you what you think it's telling you, you're going to miss the boat every single time. So a great example is like, I'm in sales, so revenue reporting. So I get revenue reporting, be like, oh, you're down 20%. Like, great. Like, all right, the business might be suffering. Like, all right, well, you might suggest that. Or what if I told you 3 companies actually went bankrupt and can't pay their bills, and we had to write them off the books, right? Plus, the overall spend in the market decreased by 30%. So I'm actually decreasing less and have lost 3 clients basically on bankruptcy. Well, then that gives context. Because without that context, then you start rooting around for problems that don't necessarily exist. So the role of the analyst is the humanizing element of data, which was another theme up here, right? Which is you have to have a relative starting point in terms of looking at what the intelligence is spitting out, and then framing that around what you know about your business, what you know about the environment, what the current environment looks like, what are the factors that are influencing that environment that may not be considered in the data set, right? You don't ever want to just act. It's not, hey, if I get this click and these many clicks, then I'm going to optimize for this creative. It's a lot different than that. And I think there's going to be a greater level of responsibility for organizations to invest in the type of people who can actually have a look at what the data is saying and really interpret what it means, which is much different than just reporting it.
So looking for meaning and context to really help you identify bottlenecks with what's going on and being able to tell a story, right? So you can be actually convincing at the next board meeting why we should be paying attention to whatever that's happening.
That's right. Like, well, I really did enjoy her data visualizations, but visualizations are key. Like, people are like, I'm a data analyst, I don't like visualizations. Well, I'm a sales guy, I love visualizations, right? I work off of visualizations all day long. And that's not because I don't like the raw numbers, but because sometimes when you're dealing with different levels of information, the visualization's enough, right? It's a tool in a set of tools. Right? You wouldn't just use one screwdriver for an entire, porch build, right? You're going to use multiple tools to get it done the most efficiently you can. And sometimes data doesn't need to be displayed in its raw form. It simply needs to be shown. Right? You want creative A or B? Well, I'll tell you why. Here's creative A versus creative B. Go. And it's like, okay, creative A, let's go. And then you're off. But sometimes you need the raw data, right? You need to play around with it. You need to look at it. And so, but you also need the people who know the difference, right? Because there's also other things where, there was that movie about Katherine Johnson, Hidden Figures, right? You have to look beyond the numbers. What else are they telling you? Because if you can't ask critical questions of the numbers, or if you're not asking critical questions about the outputs, then you're really not going deep enough.
And sometimes I've noticed just even asking yourself, what else can this mean to me, right? Or what else is this information is saying can be crucial, right? How do we actually ground the conversation and frame it in the right way? Otherwise, if you start leading with reports or charts, a lot of times you lose that opportunity, and then that moment it's going to be very difficult to get everyone's attention back.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and some of the times when you're having critical data conversations, or when you're presenting data, right, to anybody who's a business owner or stakeholder within the data that you're procuring, oftentimes it is a great idea to send it well ahead, right, and literally just harvest the questions, get their mind going, because oftentimes when you present data and you're just like, here, this is why this is right, then you're basically subjected to their knee-jerk reaction, which we all have, right? You show you a chart, any one of the charts that you just looked at. There was a knee-jerk gut reaction, if you're honest with yourself. And it was either to confirm that, yep, I knew that, it's 100% true. Or it's like, oh, that's crap, and I'll tell you why. It really never goes that knee-jerk reaction of, oh, I'm going to go straight down the middle here. That's interesting. Let me ask some more questions, right? So those meetings in person generally tend to be very emotional. So you have to, and that's why I mean of democratizing the data, like create the conversation, because oftentimes you'll learn more than you think, and it's quite interesting.
And sometimes I think you want the knee-jerk reaction, whether positive or negative, just to get the attention and start the conversation.
Correct.
So we've talked about context, we talked about analysis of data, but let's talk about tools for a second. Whether it's analytics, whether it's ID resolution platforms, there's certainly no shortage. Probably at any given time, every organization is considering adding 5 other products and trying to determine which one gets the budget. So in your opinion, what does the right marketing stack looks like?
All right, here's the part in this conversation where you're all expect me to jump up with some slides, start clicking through it and telling you why GMP needs to be in every single one of your budgets. But out of respect for our partners, I will not do that, although I'm twitching because I really will.
I'm happy to do it later, over drinks.
I'm paying Michael to do that. So it depends, right? And it does. If we're being honest and really transparent inside an industry, which I hope all leaders and anybody who's part of this industry should be, it depends. It depends on culture. It depends on what you're ready to do, right? We used to say out there in 5-6 years ago, right, we're going to give you one view of the customer. Well, that's crap. No one can give you one view of the customer, right? If you're a consumer-based business, you have a tough enough time getting one view of the customer. And so what we can do is we can give you a better view of the customer, but it's all dependent on what parts of that do you need. So I would argue someone with high data fidelity in first-party data, like really strong, like 30 years worth of loyalty program data inputs that's 90% refreshed every year and very, very active on their file, they'll do pretty well. They don't need a lot of database infrastructure, right? You could probably add some really cool reporting and analytics capabilities on top of that. Others really need kind of that holding hand, which is like, I'm going to take you from literally laying on the floor to crawling, to walking, and then maybe to jogging. And oftentimes people are like, oh, I want to get to running. It's like, you're never really always running, right? You kind of do it in sprints, because the evolution of the industry, it keeps on changing. It's so darn fluid that it's really difficult, for even someone like me, this is my full-time job, to keep up with everything that's happening, whether it relates to regulatory issues, policy issues. And so those are also things that you need to consider, right? Are you in health? Are you in healthcare? Well, great. Now you've got a completely different set of policies and regulations. Are you a global advertiser? Awesome. Well, now you've got to bring in the EU and GDPR and figure out what all those revisions are saying country by country. So it really depends on kind of where your resources are and where your appetite is. There is one universal thing I would say is that, for the most part, we've seen people who are really successful who understand where their lanes are and where their skill sets really are, and don't spend resourcing on, hey, I'm going to build my own ad server. It's like, why? Like, what is the added benefit for you to do that versus figuring out, look, how do you get an integration layer across all of these assets to give me a general view? And I'd say, lastly, on that, as people look to develop their own stacks and buy and build and partner, I think one of the baseline tenets of that you really need to get comfortable with is that it's going to be co-opted, right? It's going to take multiple partners, including yourself, including all of the different divisions within your organizations, wherever that may be, multiple technologies. And you will rarely get to a common denominator, which is that individual customer, right? But you can get pretty darn close. You can get very good directionally based information, right? And as my boss, Sean Downey, often says, right, like, privacy is not at odds with performance. We've proven performance works at scale, and we don't have to sacrifice an individual's privacy online to do that. So I think it's something that the industry needs to hear over and over again, because it's going to become a reality, right? Like when cookies are redacted, it's going to become a modeled world. And I think that, quite honestly, unless you're a consumer-based company and you have that relationship with the consumer, then no technology company or vendor, including our own, should be helping to identify an individual across the web, right? It's akin to me walking into a mall and going into, West Elm and looking at a couch and leaving. And then I show up at Nike and I'm shopping for some sneakers. And the sales rep from West Elm is banging on the glass with a picture of the couch going, hey, you're looking at this. You're still interested? It's 20% off now, right? And I leave Nike, and then the Nike and West Elm person are standing there in the next window. Like, that's creepy. We wouldn't accept that in the real world, so there's no reason for us to accept it now.
It's interesting that you mentioned internal partners. A lot of times I think advertisers think about partners as we need an integration partner, we need a service partner, a technology partner. But sometimes we forget that we actually need partners within our own organization, right? If you're building something under the office of CIO, don't forget other parts of your business that can support you. A lot of times I meet with advertisers and they end up somehow building two different data lakes because they did not align which one they actually need. Seems a little bit wasteful. So I know we are running a little bit short on time. Let me ask you a question. Obviously, the session is going to end in a few hours. For our audience, right, if we were to leave this end in mind, what would you want people to remember as they leave today's session? Maybe 2 or 3 key takeaways.
2 or 3 key takeaways. All right. Well, first is that, like, in the industry, there's a lot of noise right now, right? Some of it's really accurate and actually beneficial and things that you should listen to, and others are not. But you should all educate yourself on what's actually going on out there, right? And just in terms of data, in terms of redaction and policies, and don't rely on, third parties to kind of tell you that. Definitely source your own information, because it is actually going to be critical for your business going forward. That being said, with all of the noise out there, it can get somewhat overwhelming, right? It's anxiety inducing, at least it is for me. And that's okay, right? Like, every single time the industry has changed, right? When you looked at the advent of digital and everyone threw up their arms like, oh my gosh, here comes this digital thing, like internet advertising, right? Is what we used to call it. It's internet advertising. It doesn't work, right? Lo and behold, here we are. Then for all of those of my colleagues who have been out here as long as I have, this is the year of mobile. Like, if you were in the industry at that time, the year of mobile literally lasted 5 years. And it was said every year during those 5 years, no, this is going to be the year of mobile. And then it was the year of mobile, and we still weren't ready, which was actually kind of comical. And then now there's AI, right? Now there's policy and privacy. And while it's chaotic, right, you have to keep in mind that's where the growth comes from. It's where the education comes from. And that's also why our industry is so amazing. Like, how many industries change and get to reinvent themselves over and over again? How many industries afford you the ability to actually be a pioneer? Not many I know, right? I used to work in radio after I graduated college. I mean, that was horrible. But if there's anybody radio buyers out there, it wasn't that bad. So that's the first thing, is it's going to be okay, right? And oftentimes education can soothe your anxiety, right? Just know what's coming. The end of the world is not, in fact, here. It's just cookies going away, and it's actually not that big of a deal. I'd say the second thing is that partnerships, internal partnerships, are going to be key. Right. And so I think, in that, like, you have to have supporters, you have to have champions internally as you look to democratize your data, as you look to evolve your strategies, right? And always understand and get them and bring them along on the journey in terms of what problems are you trying to solve, not just for today, because oftentimes in companies, that's what happens. Like, oh my gosh, this is happening right now, and I got to solve for it. So let's get Mark and Frank and Donna in here, and we can just, brainstorm on how we're going to actually react to it. But what is the future going to be like in 12 months? Because when it gets here, and it's going to get here like really quickly, we need to be prepared. So make sure you give yourself space to think about that, right? Give yourself some thinking time in that. And then the last is, look, data is in fact key, right? I've always maintained that. I double down, triple down on it today. And, we went through this evolution where people were outsourcing a lot of this stuff to partners and vendors, and then they all want to bring it back. One thing has to remain consistent if you're a consumer-based company, and that is your ownership of that data, right? So there are great partners like InfoTrust out there, right, who simply help you and enable you to understand and curate that data. But at the end of the day, you own it. And so that's one thing that that is a non-starter for all these companies, and it really should be part of the culture inside your run.
Fantastic. Steve, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.